All right. Hello, folks. It's Monday, so that means another pairing stream with James Shore and myself. How's everybody doing?
Sorry, what was that, Ted? I didn't catch that last one.
How's everybody doing, including you?
Oh, including me. Well, I'm doing good. I'm really looking forward to this. Looking forward to this session because we're going to get into the error handling for the databases.
Right.
And I strongly believe that error handling is sort of what separates the great software developers from the merely okay software developers, is their willingness and ability to look at errors.
Mm-hmm.
How was your weekend?
Very productive, actually. I've been continuing working on my hexagonal architecture course, as well as getting ready for my presentation on this week, my TED Talk for this week on February 16th. So figuring out what I have time to include and what I won't.
Yeah, there's never enough time to include everything, is there?
Yeah, especially when I want to allow people to ask questions. So
yeah.
So database. So last time, do you want to catch us up on where we've gotten to? Let me
switch to so for those of you who have never watched us before, what we're working on is a game called Yacht, which is basically the open source version of Yahtzee, the original version of Yahtzee, and as I understand it, which is, of course, a dice rolling game where you want to get certain combinations of dice to score points. Quite a while ago, Ted created a web-based version of this game, and we've been modifying it to use my Nullables approach for testing, when possibly looking at doing A-frame architecture in the future. That's why this is called the Nullables and A-frame architecture stream, although we've done very, very little A-frame architecture.
Yeah.
We finished that work, and then we said, well, let's expand a little bit further. Let's put in persistence. Let's give you the ability to store and retrieve your games from a database, because right now you touch on the server, the game's gone forever. And I assume we will, Suiji, that we'll get there. I don't know if that's actually true, but hopefully. So we're adding persistence, and we're doing that in sort of the way I would do it, using my A-frame architecture ideas and nullable ideas. And one of those ideas is the idea of narrow integration tests, which is that we are writing tests of how the infrastructure wrapper, the adapter for the database, actually talks to the underlying database. So one way to do this would be to just use Hibernate, which is what we're using here, to store stuff in the database, and then in the test, retrieve it back out and see if that worked. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're actually putting stuff in the database at the SQL level and confirming that that's how Hibernate works. And the advantage of that is that it gives us really clear documentation of how Hibernate is actually persisting the data. The disadvantage of it is that it took us a little bit extra time to do that. But in the grand scheme of things, the time we spent on that, 4 hours, two episodes, so 6 hours minus whatever for us jabbering, is not too bad, sort of, for establishing the pattern how to do that for anything.
Yeah, and like you've said many times, once you have this, it's pretty easy to retarget it and redeploy it in different projects. And as you build up both knowing what to do, as well as some abstractions around it, some refactoring around it, to make it easier to work with, then like many things, the first time is always the hardest, figuring it out, and then the second time gets a little easier, and then it's all smooth sailing from there.
And what I find is that people go with the magic tools because they present a really easy on-ramp, whereas what I'm talking about is a difficult on-ramp, and ironically more difficult the more magic tools you're using. But that easy on-ramp sort of turns into a traffic jam when you reach the things that the tools don't support. And for a lot of this stuff, they're not actually adding that much value. Like, I will, a framework that supports forms and cross-site scripting protection and all this stuff, that's a lot of work to produce something like that.
Right.
But what Hibernate is giving us is not that much more than what we get from just writing this stuff out with SQL. Like, it's saving us for what we have right now. It's saving us about as much time as it's cost us in terms of the work we've done. And it's, now that we've got that figured out, I don't think it's saving us that much more than just writing SQL statements. Using prepared statements would have saved us. Now, granted, that's because we are using a proper database wrapper architecture. Right. But as you mentioned way back when, we talked about, using Hibernate in your domain layer and your annotations in your domain layer. That way lies madness.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't want to do that because you hit that on ramp, you're going real fast, and then bam, it turns out that the tunnel you thought was drilled through the mountain is actually just a Wile E. Coyote painted black arch. So yeah, that's my analogy for the day.
I love that analogy. That's great. and yeah, like even here, like I was actually thinking about working. Like here I'm using JPA, which is really Hibernate underneath in my Ensembler application, which is a production app that I use for managing my ensembles. I'm using Spring Data JDBC, which is lighter weight. And I feel like it provides just enough. Like I still would have to, if I was writing, raw SQL, I'd have to, read that in and then figure out, which column type maps to what and then map objects. And so for me, I use it as just that thing that, I could write that, but it'd be, a little bit of work to do that mapping. And maybe I'd only do that mapping once, but it's like just enough of the layer. Whereas like Hibernate does so much in terms of caching and persistence and in persistence sort of in dirty checking and things like that, where I feel like the modern way of doing apps, you actually don't want that. And it's complexity that's serving no purpose.
Right. I mean, it does serve a purpose. Like all that caching and so forth is supposed to give you high performance in difficult situations. But the reality is that when you get into those difficult situations, not knowing what's going on, like having to figure out why something isn't working. Like if you want to tune a database, you're going to be going in and looking at your database performance characteristics. And a tool like Hibernate, unless you know it inside and out, is going to really obscure what's going on. And it's going to make it that much more difficult to figure out what to do. I'm definitely not, using nothing would involve writing our own little C library or connecting, I don't know. I don't even know how to talk to a database with raw connections, right?
I don't want to.
Because what'd you say?
I don't want to.
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody should do that.
Right.
So it's not build everything yourself.
Right.
There is a thoughtful decision that needs to be made about how much is this abstraction getting me versus how much it's costing me. Right. And what I see people doing when they think about this is they never think about what's it costing me. They only think about what's it getting me. Yeah. And they're thinking about I particularly see this you see this amongst juniors and people with senior titles, but they think that the cost of development is about how hard is it to get the features out. Mm-hmm. The cost of development is overwhelmingly how much does it cost to maintain the code. You write the code once, you maintain it effectively forever. Right. And that cost dramatically outweighs the cost of creating something the first time.
Yeah, and that's not taken into account in most companies that I've encountered, nobody takes that into account ever in terms of saying this feature is done. It's like, okay, it's done, but until it's used where people are not finding problems with it, like, I was just say, it's like, yeah, I might seem to be slower, but when my code's out there, because I did TDD and I did all other good design, it's like, it's solid and we can move on. And it's not like, oh, now there's 2 weeks of stabilization and all this kind of thing, where it's like, that's a cost too that you're not attributing back to the original development. And then later on, people start complaining, why is it taking you so long to add this feature to this simple feature to this thing? It's like, well, because of the way it's designed and we incurred that cost. And there's, huge debates around single page applications versus the old style. And there was a recent mention of a blog post, and it was like, Yes, SPAs can make really good applications, but only if management understands what the cost is and whether it's worth, like you said, whether it's worth that cost. If it's mostly forms, then it's like, I'm sorry, but it's not worth that cost. Yes, if it's a full stateful, you're running basically what would have been a desktop app 15 years ago, you're running it in the web browser and you're in there for a good part of the day. Yes, probably worth it. But a lot of things, that cost is high, but nobody counts it.
Yeah, it's true. Hey, 404, welcome. Yeah, so that's our rant on non-invented here for the day, I think.
Right.
It is tricky. It's not there's no right answer, but I think the problem I see is that people do think there's an easy, quick answer. And it's just, you got to stop and think about these things carefully rather than just going with what's easy. So anyway, to move on, we are using Hibernate because we wanted to demonstrate how this would work in a situation where you are sort of stuck with the architecture that maybe isn't what you would choose. But we're also assuming that we have a kind of a real world situation where the database is not an opaque black box. There's a business intelligence department, or maybe it's an enterprise database. Maybe you've got multiple services or applications accessing the database. All this stuff is real. If this was just an opaque black box, given the actual thing that we have here, we'd probably use just a blob and a NoSQL data store. But which is something we talked about originally. Yeah. But we're assuming that people are accessing this data or doing analytics on this data in some way. So it is SQL. And what we need to do here then is make sure that, because the database schema is in effect a published API to these other organizations in our non-existent company, we need to make sure that it works right, even when the schema has been misused, even when data has been corrupted in some way. Not because the database is corrupted, but because people have inserted or deleted things that they weren't supposed to. Right. We need to make sure that works. And this, again, I think comes back to that separating the great programmers from the merely okay programmers, is whether or not they consider error handling when they write their code. And you particularly need to consider error handling at the edges of your system. You can use test-driven development and other testing practices to make sure the code that you write works. But no amount of TDD is going to make sure that people from the outside use your code and use your systems correctly.
Yeah, it's always this sort of defensive perimeter of trying to protect that your application from being sort of poisoned or infected by either just wrong data, incorrect data, invalid data. And that's, it's because it's like, to me, that perimeter is really, the stronger you make that perimeter, the easier it is on the rest of your code. You're not constantly checking things that should have been handled at the edge. So
and this is where A-frame architecture comes in. This is where infrastructure wrappers come in, adapters come in, hexagonal architecture. All of these techniques define a strong perimeter. So, and the perimeter lives in the adapters. That's what's responsible for managing that perimeter. So in the adapter is the right place to check, are we getting the data? And then another trick that the less experienced developers pull is then when they get something that's incorrect, they return null. It's where, as Suichi just said, it's where the nulls go to die. If you ever find yourself doing a try catch and then returning null, I will come and beat you. I will come and hunt you down, because that is just, don't do that.
Don't
do that. The purpose of try catch is not to be your logger. You don't want to say catch error, log, oh, I got an error, return null. That is not the right way to do it. So what we're going to be doing today is hopefully the right way to do it. And the right way to do it is to say, well, what could go wrong and how do we want to handle that?
And I think
often just by throwing an exception.
And I think that latter part is really hard. Sometimes it's, do I throw an exception? Do I return some default? And sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not. And one of the things I like about that Java, when Java introduced optional, I think it didn't really hit home for me how powerful it was, except in this specific case, it's like, look, I either should find it because somebody gave me this ID, so presumably somebody thought that this thing with this identifier existed. And if not, well, then I should have two choices. It's either I return the thing or I throw, a not found exception or something like that. And proper use of optionals, they're not perfect. And of course, Java allows nulls, but if you really focus on that, I found it pushes that decision right in your face, because it's like, you can't just say check for null and maybe you forget. It's like, you've either got to deal with it or it worked fine and everything's good.
Yeah, no, I love optional. Of course, that comes from functional programming types of work. And I think true functional languages handle the error problem well. As you know, and we've talked about this before, Java did a really valiant attempt at handling this well when it was first created, with the distinction between checked and unchecked exceptions. Right. The idea was that unchecked exceptions or runtime exceptions are mistakes that programmers have made. But checked exceptions are problems that have come from the outside world that must be handled because they cannot be fixed automatically. There's no amount of correct programming that will prevent a checked exception from happening. Unfortunately, most of the people who wrote libraries for Java did not seem to get that memo. And so you got checked exceptions being thrown where they should have been unchecked, unchecked exceptions being thrown when they should have been checked, and just a giant mess. So now you can no longer really rely on a checked exception being something that really refers to an external error. So I think optional and other patterns where you're returning a result and an error of some sort are really powerful ways of solving the same problem that hopefully the vast majority of I just want to get it done programmers won't ruin. Yeah, I'm asking a lot, aren't I? I've gotten, I've been programming for 30 years, Ted, and I'm burned out. I'm just so sick of this. Maybe it comes through. It is possible to write really good code, and it's not that hard. But you have to be focused on writing good code and not just getting features out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that's like to what CG's talked about, cowboy coders who always got the credit of, I got, feature done, right, move on to the next thing, whereas now I'm busy cleaning up their code because they didn't take the time and care. And it's, to me, these are all skills, and my favorite people to work with are those who are curious about improvement. They may not know precisely what they need to do differently. They may just be frustrated with boy, yet again, I'm solving this problem. We've seen it before, and I think it could have been prevented with some technique, but I don't know what. But those were my favorite people to work with, is those who wanted to just make their lives better and make their and actually care about, because as I said very often, like we write the code for other people, right? Yeah. The compiler doesn't care. You could use single letter variables and single letter method names, compile it and put it all in one big method. But we write for other people, and that means I think we need to have that empathy for both ourselves in the future and other people to really want and be motivated to write better code.
I think empathy is the perfect word for it. When you're writing code, I mean, what I do constantly when I'm writing code is I'm always imagining, how is this going to be perceived in the future by myself and by others, and how can it go wrong, and what can I do to help? I think one of our, I don't remember if it was Suiji or Whiskey or somebody else, but last time they talked about the pit of success. You want to sort of write your code so that the default is correct behavior, and that's why I like optional.
Yeah,
because it makes it much harder to not have the correct behavior.
Right.
Now, of course, you can still design your stuff to not use optional and to return, log an exception and return null, but you do have the ability, people who are the folks that there's a distinction to be made between people who are trying and ignorant, don't know how to make something work, and people who just don't care,
right,
and are
yes, exactly,
rest and invest in.
Exactly.
And it's the folks who really care, regardless of how much they know. Those are the ones I love working with.
Exactly.
Just like you're saying.
Yeah.
And the folks who are just, playing political games, getting stuff done as quick as possible, or, maybe they're in a toxic environment. They've thrown up their hands and said, well, nothing I do is going to work here. You save yourselves from that,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Go find a place where you can be happy and do good work.
That's where the change your organization, if you can't improve it and you can't do good work and be, work with people who want to do good work, then switch organizations and move on to one that where that's more likely to happen. Yep.
Yeah.
Just a few.
Yeah. All right. So now that we've ranted at people for half an hour. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to Ted's TED Talk. Let's do some of these database tests.
Yeah.
So we've gotten the saving and loading in the happy path done, which means we've done about 10% of the work. And so now we need to take care of the sad paths. And I did write down there in our to-do a couple of things that could go wrong. And so I think these could be divided into two parts. One is just, we're asking for something that doesn't exist. We're trying to load a game that doesn't exist,
right?
Which is sort of happy path behavior in a way. And then we've got truly corrupted data. The columns have nulls in them, or a table, the join table doesn't have what it's looking for.
Right.
Yeah. I imagine we'll think of more as we go through this.
Yeah, at least 10% was figuring out creative native query.
Yeah, it's true. So let's start out with a not found case, because we've got this small elephant in the room. We've got a baby pachyderm in the room, which is that we've said we don't want to build support for multiple games from the beginning.
That was not our first. Our first intention was there's only the one game.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, so here's something I found. Tell me if you've seen this, Ted. I love evolutionary design. I love working really incrementally, only building what I need when I need it. What I have found, though, is that if I break down things down too incrementally, I actually end up adding work. Now I'm building things that I don't need in the future, but I need now just to make it so I don't have to build the thing that I am going to build in the future. And I think we're kind of in that situation here a little bit. If we're truly going to support just one game, we now have to put in all this logic about finding the one game and making that work. Right. So I wonder if we'd be better off saying, well, yes, we're going to support multiple games, but we're just not going to build it out in the rest of the app. But in our adapter here, we will support multiple games.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I mean, that's a really good point. It's like, do you not only think you're not going to need it, but you're actually going to actively not need it, right? Like, right. Or is it just that this is part of Yagni? We don't need multiple games just yet. Let's just do one game. But we are probably going to, and it's, and again, it all is judgment. And, but I like that idea of, am I building stuff that will prevent me from taking that next step? If I think it's likely, then don't build that.
Yeah. I call that, so I when I think about evolutionary design, I think about it at three levels. You've got the method level, the class level, the intra-class level, intra-class, interclass, and architecture. Right. So within a single file, across multiple files, and then architecture is the repeated patterns in your system, which I want to minimize to the most degree possible, because when you decide to make changes to those repeated patterns, it's really expensive. When I'm thinking about how I want to design my code, I'm thinking, what can I do to prevent costs from increasing in the future? And when I'm looking at architectural questions, I'm thinking, well, I don't want to say that I'm definitely going to have this thing come up in the future, because it might happen, it might not. But I definitely don't want to design anything that's going to make the future more difficult, which is sort of what you're getting back to here. And the example I always give is internationalization.
Right.
we do not need to design this so that we support multiple languages.
Right.
But we also need to, if we think that internationalization is a possibility, we also need to not design it so that internationalization is hard.
Right.
Don't put the internationalization in, but don't make it hard either.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's where we're at here, except it's even stronger. Yes, we will need multiple games. This is our backers, are the VC capital we've collected for this.
Yes.
Which I think is about 3 cents at this point. They are not going to be happy with something that only supports one game. Like, there is no world in which we have only one game when this is truly properly done. But at the same time, we don't need to do all that design work yet. We just need to not paint ourselves in the corner on that.
Right. Yeah, and I think here that line is pretty straightforward, but there are times definitely where it's like, designing something, like, it's almost like you're building scaffolding, but you're not going to need the thing that the scaffolding supports just yet. And so you've built all this scaffolding, and it's like, okay. And then you have to, and then you get into the problems of now you have to maintain that scaffolding, but it's not real. Yeah. It's fake. And yeah.
And the thing with that kind of scaffolding, like, I think that people build too much far more often than they build too little.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about is not really the common,
no, it's not the common experience. The case, yeah.
The common experience is that, I imagine that I'm going to need this thing. You build a castle in the sky,
right?
Then you actually implement it. And then when the time comes to add that feature, your scaffolding is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so much harder to take out scaffolding that's wrong than it is to put in scaffolding that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So I don't want to build a lot of scaffolding around this. I do want to think, though, what API do we want to present to the user? We could present a load and save that takes no IDs, and then we just hard code the ID here. Or we could present a load and a save that presents some sort of opaque ID, like a GUID, because you don't want to expose your primary keys. And I'm okay with either one. But right now we have, if you scroll up a little bit on somewhere, I think, right now on line 111 on the tests, or 88 as well.
Yeah.
Right now we are passing the primary key, and I think that's wrong. Like, we either don't have a primary key or we have an opaque ID that doesn't reflect the primary key. But it should be one or the other.
So tell me more about why you don't want to expose the primary key at this level.
So are we agreed that we don't want to expose the primary key to the user?
Right now, absolutely, yes.
I mean, ever, as a design principle?
Sure, yes, because that can always expose, I can look at somebody else's game and it might be predictable and things like that. Absolutely, yeah.
There's security issues, but there's also just database refactoring issues,
right.
Where you end up with that primary key sort of threaded out in a bunch of different parts of your system. So we don't want to expose the primary key to the user. So then the question is, well, is it okay to expose it from our database abstraction to the rest of our app? And I could probably be talked into doing that in multiple ways, but since the purpose of this code is to provide sort of a black box to the database, it seems to me that the primary key is an implementation detail that we don't want to expose. That if we're exposing some handle for the rest of the app to deal with, then we want to expose a handle that we are okay with. I mean, it's sort of that pit of success that we're talking about.
Right.
If we expose something that's not supposed to go out to the user, then who's making that decision and how do we know they're making it correctly?
Right.
This seems like the right place to do that.
Yep. Okay. That makes sense.
So from that perspective, just, evolutionary design is about only building what you need now, but it doesn't mean you never think about the future. Right. And often what I'll do when I'm doing evolutionary design, because I'm trying to think, how can I build this so that I can incrementally add to it as cheaply as possible? I will often think, well, how might I implement this in the future so that I don't paint myself into the corner? So as I think about how I might implement this in the future, I'm thinking that we've got the primary key that's secret to the database. multiple games, we're going to need some sort of, I would probably use a GUID to represent the handle to the game that we expose to the user and to the application.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an additional column,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a parameter on load game.
Right.
And maybe on save game, or maybe that's part of our snapshot. I don't know exactly where we store that handle. And then, of course, there's all this stuff we have to do around the UI, and I really don't want to think about that yet. So I am leaning towards, well, let's just not do that now. But if we were to add it in the future, what that would mean would be adding a column, probably pre-production. Like, we do this refactoring before we rolled out to production, because this is really not usable at all without multiple games.
Right.
So refactoring costs are minimal, right? Because there's not going to be any real data in the database yet. So we don't have to worry about migrating data.
Right.
So we can add a column for free, which is our GUID, or our database handle key or whatever, our game handle key.
Mm-hmm.
We would modify our load and maybe save game to take a parameter. All those costs seem fairly minimal to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, making those changes, if we're not doing data migration, is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
So as I'm thinking about how we would need to support multiple games in the future, what I'm thinking is having load and save game just only work against one game with a hard-coded ID seems pretty easy and straightforward.
Yep.
What do you think?
I agree. And even if it were, hey, we put it into, alpha production, I think that even the migration would be, assuming there aren't already, there's only one.
Right. There's only going to be one.
So I think migrating away from one, I think is certainly manageable. It's basically, okay, let's create one, GUID and put it in there, and then we're done. So even if we had to do the migration, I think it would be really straightforward.
Yeah. The cost of refactoring databases is really twofold. One is data migration, which is only an issue when you've got a lot of data, like probably millions of rows, because otherwise you can just write a little migration script and have it run when you deploy, and it's done in a couple of minutes. Right. But data migration is only difficult when you need to do multi-day incremental migration with writing and reading to multiple tables at the same time to maintain performance.
Right.
That's a hassle. We don't want to do that.
No, we don't want to do that.
We're not going to do that with one game. It's not an issue.
Right. There's no locking the database for hours that we have to worry about. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one issue with migrating data and refactoring databases. And hey, Pixie.
Hey, Pixie. Oh, no, gosh.
And the other issue with databases is that it can be a published interface. If you've got other apps going into the same database, or if you've got business intelligence, then it can be really expensive to rename or move columns.
Right, because now you've got all the coordination problems that are endemic and shared things like that.
Yeah, and one way to sort of work around that is to say, well, you don't access our tables, you access the views we provide, and then when we change our tables, we change the views accordingly. Right. But again, that's not an issue for us. Right. And adding columns is never an issue for that situation.
Right.
If they've programmed their code properly and, named their columns, or, they're not just going to die when they see a column that they didn't expect.
Exactly. Yeah. If they're doing a select star and then it blows up because, we added a column, then don't do that.
That's not our problem.
That's not our problem. That's the cowboy coder's problem.
Yeah, exactly. So that all this has been a sort of long-winded way for me to say that I think the costs of adding multi-user support in the future are acceptable.
Yeah.
And given that if we do that design work when we're actually working on it, we'll come up with a better design. It's probably cheaper to make that change in the future than to do it now.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the idea that and this is something that really is hard for people who haven't worked with this, like that it can actually be easier and cheaper to implement something in the future than to implement it now, because that goes against so many sort of embedded and ingrained sort of, and not even based on any sort of real experience that people have, just sort of handed down wisdom supposedly. And it's like, no, that, cost, that doesn't, the whole cost of change problem. So.
Well, everybody has experience with things getting more expensive over time.
Yeah.
And so their default assumption is that I have to put things in now because it will be more expensive to change later. But the problem with that that problem with that experience is that happens because people put in stuff
Right.
in advance and they get it wrong and then they don't refactor.
Yeah, so
But
I don't think people are paying attention to why is this harder? I thought it would be easier because we put in flexibility, but then seeing that you put the flexibility in the wrong place and that now it actually is harder because you were trying to make it easier. And I don't think people reflect on why is this so hard and tracing it back to those decisions.
Yeah. I don't know if this is going to show up, but this is from my book, The Art of Agile Development. Pull this over so y'all can hear me. That diagram, that's what you see with evolutionary design. This is the cost of change, and this is number of changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
This is actual empirical data from real work that I've done. It does get cheaper over time if you're doing test-driven development and frequent refactoring and the simplest possible thing and doing evolutionary design. So few people have had that experience, but it's magical.
Yep.
It is magical. So yeah, only add what you need when you need it, and it will be cheaper to solve the problems in the future.
I love it when procrastination pays off.
Yeah. Yeah. What are the three virtues of the Perl programmer? They're laziness, hubris, and what is the third one? I don't remember. But laziness is basically impatience. Yeah, laziness, hubris, and impatience. There's so much truth to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think then what we need to do is we need to modify this. If we're agreed that we're going to support loading and saving multiple games later, we need to modify our load and save so that they do not take an ID.
Right.
Right now, save always does an insert, right?
Correct. So let's see. Save. Are you talking about the JPA save or our save? I mean, our save uses. So I think right now it's basically doing insert. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you said it's an upsert, but I think what we're doing at the moment is.
Because we're not restoring the ID, so it doesn't see that it's the same thing. So it's just doing an insert. Yeah.
So I think in our test, what we need to do is we need to find the cases where we're calling game database.save and make sure that so that just takes the snapshot. The snapshot doesn't have an ID, so that's fine. Right. So let's look at load. I think load is where we're passing in an ID.
Yeah, so those two lines, this one.
Okay. So let's modify our save so that we hard code the ID.
So,
I was going to say let's modify the test first.
Which test do you want to modify? You want to modify the load?
Let's start at the very top and just go through it one at a time. Can we just run this one test to make this easier?
Yep.
So what I'm thinking is that we've got writes core game state to database, writes storyboard state to database. Let's we could either modify one of our tests or we can add a new test that's something like always writes to same ID or something like that. And then
I'm thinking modifying these tests.
Okay, so just so that it's select blah from games where ID equals something or other.
I was thinking that we'd select with the ID without the where clause, and that would make it. I don't know which is better.
Let me toss down an idea here, if it's okay with you.
Yeah.
Always writes to same ID because we only support one game for now. We don't care what game it is. And then what's our game ID going to be? Lucky Sevens?
Sure.
Or we could do something like game database dot game ID. But I tend to duplicate in my tests those sorts of constants just to make it more clear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know how to do this assertion. How do I assert that the game rows is of length 1?
We can just do size 1.
Perfect.
And so then we're saying we don't care about the actual content.
Yeah, and although we could put this in our existing tests, I feel like this is a weird decision that we're making here. Let's say that we both get hit by a winning lottery ticket, and somebody comes in hired by the VCs to continue modifying our code,
right?
And they're going to look at this and say, what's going on here? I want it to be really clear that this is a temporary thing that we're doing just for now, and that's why I want to give it that weird test name.
Yeah, and I really like that because you sort of separating what you just said is like that this is going to go away. This is a separate aspect, and maybe it hangs around for a little bit, but it's a separate aspect. It's not part. It's sort of that different view of the different part of the behavior, that it's not just part of saving. It's actually explicitly, hey, there is the only one.
Yeah. And I think that's what, because I always say tests are documentation, but when you're naming your tests and when you're writing your tests, you really want to be thinking about this.
Right.
And often I will, when I'm writing something, I will just put the tests out to get the code written, and then I'll refactor the test to say, well, how are people going to think about this? But this is definitely a different concern, a different concept, and I want to call it out really explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
Some interesting comments here on the in the chat. I have not done as much ensembling, teaming, mobbing as Ted has. But that's been my experience too, is that a good pair, like it's taken us a little while. We'd never paired before doing these streams. It's taken us a little while to sort of like settle into the groove. But a good pair is very dynamic, like switching off the keyboard, and sort of two brains working together in a way that an ensemble has not been in my experience.
Yeah,
what about your experience?
Yeah, so I think the pairing is much more intense, and it's because you're, whether you're driving or navigating, you're always actively thinking, actively engaged, which is good. But I actually also think it can be part of the downside of pairing, which is why I always these days prefer ensembles, because there's that time where you can step back a bit. You can contribute if you're not the navigator or driver in an actual working group, unlike the way I run learning ensembles, where I want to focus on just the driver and navigator to get them to learn. But as a group, when we're trying to get work done, everybody should be contributing. But the sort of a little bit of a rest, a little bit of a separation, I think is so valuable that you don't really get in pairing unless you're really super conscious of it. Or you do, when I was working with Pivotal Labs, they do rotations of pair groups. So you work with one person in the morning and work with somebody else in the afternoon. And so I think that's also important, is to shift gears, because otherwise it can almost be too intense.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Something you get in an ensemble is the opportunity to sort of sit back and let your brain process and not necessarily focus on what's happening in front of you right now, which does give you that sort of opportunity, or even like go on your computer and research something that you think is helpful. You can't really do that when you're pairing. It's funny that you mentioned that about Pivotal, because the way I've always learned pairing is that you should be changing partners every 2 to 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But I know there are some places that do pairing where you stay with the same person for days at a time.
Yeah, usually it's like, oh, it's inefficient if we have to switch while we're working on a single story. It's like, well, your story's too big, but switch anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the value, I think they're completely wrong on that point. Part of the value of pairing is collective ownership.
Yeah.
And you want the whole team to be aware of how everything works.
Exactly.
You don't get that if you're not, not shaking things up and moving things around.
Yeah.
But it does take a while for people who have not paired before, even if they have a lot of experience with pairing, it takes a while for them to get comfortable working together.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have found that to be less of a cost in a mob.
Oh yeah, yeah. The ability to pick up new people and drop people, because when I'm running my learning ensembles, it's a rotating group. Sometimes there's some constants, but there's always somebody who hasn't been there for a month, or is and the ability to, you're a little shaky at the beginning, but after a round, everybody's in gear and in sync, and it is, I like Suiji said, step back and take a mental shower, like basically not having, there's different kinds of engagement, and you sort of focus versus sort of diffuse, or however you want to think about it, and being able to let, think longer term, or, oh, that was sucky, maybe there's a better way, and just letting it, ruminate on that, I think is really sort of unanticipated for me when I really sort of first doing ensembles.
Yeah, when I first wrote ensembles, I was not a fan because I work really hard with my teams to create these very effective collective ownership team environments where you get all the benefits that you get from ensembles. And to be honest, the jury is still out for me about how much better or worse ensembles are than that kind of effective team environment. Mm-hmm. But what I noticed with ensembles is that it is so much easier to get started, so much less resistance from people on doing it, so much simpler to create that high productivity environment. It basically comes for free. We're just doing a really effective pairing environment. It takes time. People commented when we started doing these streams, Ted, they commented how careful we were about, making suggestions and like not stepping on each other's toes. And it wasn't really until I think episode 8 or 9, and this is number 11, where I felt we were starting to kind of share the burden a little bit more. So yeah, it just takes time to get it at pairing, and ensembling is super easy.
Yeah.
Pixie, you mentioned, does the test need to be renamed? And I'm not sure what you're getting at there. I feel like we've got a pretty good name now. So go ahead and toss your thoughts in the chat.
All right, should we watch it fail?
Yeah, let's watch it fail. And making this pass is going to be a little bit tricky because we do have tests that assume a specific ID.
Yep. So fail as expected.
Okay. So let's make this one test pass, and then we'll look at those other tests that are going to fail because they have hard-coded IDs that are different.
So let's try this. This should break the other tests. Oh. That was surprising. What happened?
That failed, right?
That did fail.
Because we've got ID set as a auto-incrementing key?
But it shouldn't. So that's that.
Yeah, we've got it as a generated value. If we comment out that generated value, what happens?
My understanding, and we'll try that, but my understanding is that if it came in with an ID, it thinks that it's an update and should not have been overriding the ID coming in.
Well, maybe it's smart enough to know that it doesn't exist in the database, and then it's an insert.
Yeah, so there's some tricky stuff with with Spring Data JDBC. I'd be pretty sure that worked. With Spring Data JPA, the Hibernate, there's you may have to do a retrieval. If you want to do an update, you may have to retrieve it first. Then it knows that it's what's called attached or not detached. So let's
This is exactly.
So this is where that magic,
me.
that extra magic comes in. It's like, oh, we don't think we know about that. Yeah. So can I try something? I want to actually test that hypothesis. Let's do, instead of this, let's do in database JPA, find by ID. No, but it's not going to be found, so it's not really an update. Yeah, I think
no, it is an insert.
Yeah, I think for an insert, yeah, it's sort of to protect against the case where you're trying to do what you think is an update, but that object doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is truly an insert, and so it does not expect the ID if the generated value is set. Yep. All right.
So Pixie's saying, with regards to our test name, is returns a single row directly related to always writes to the same ID. I mean, we could add a message to that line 44 to make it more clear, saying should find the row with the one ID. I feel like it's obvious enough, but
I mean, I think
it's not
because
as crystal clear as sometimes you get in a good test.
I mean, it seems, yeah. I mean, because this says game rows, and because there's the where clause here, and there's not a lot of code here, I feel like it's pretty obvious what this is expecting. So yeah,
I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
All right. So we are. Thanks for bringing that up, Pixie.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I think we're good enough on this test. So should we move on to the next?
Yes.
The next thing. Okay. If you scroll down, we have a couple of cases where we're doing a 999 on our retrieve. Yeah.
Yep.
Game database.load game 9999.
Yep.
And we're on line 96, particularly. This is the one that concerns me. We're writing into games where the value is 9999.
Right.
Let's change that to 777. And now I'm starting to think maybe we should put a constant on that. But let's get this test working and then maybe pull that out. We don't change that yet.
I'm not. I'm just thinking, yeah.
Yeah, if we change this and we also change line 114 and 118 and 119, these tests will both fail. And I think that's everything that we've got that has a hard-coded ID. Don't change that one yet.
I'm not. I'm just looking to, yeah, those are the only two occurrences.
Yeah. So if we run that should fail because it's not going to find it.
Right.
And did it fail for the right reason?
Let's see. Yeah, no value present.
What's going on with our always writes to the same
That
ID?
was what I was going to look at. It seems because
did you when you did your experiment, did you put it back?
That's still fine.
No, in game table.
Oh, did I put the generate? Oh, did I do that?
Yeah, you put that back. You need to take that out.
My bad. There we go. In fact, we're saying we don't want this anymore anyway.
Yeah.
at least right now.
I mean, we'll put it back when we
when we actually
multiple.
do need multiple, right?
Yeah. Okay, so now to make this pass, I think we can just modify. I don't know where to do this at. Probably in game database. I don't want to change that. We're going to take that parameter out entirely. I want to change game database so it works even with the wrong parameter being passed in.
You don't want to just drop the parameter?
Yeah, we could do that.
Because what I was...
you're saying refactor it, drop the parameter, and replace it with a 777?
Yep.
Yeah, that works for me.
Yes, I know. Thank you for... Yes, go ahead, continue. So I expect that, and then that to now pass.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, I think we need to factor out these constants, but we are at our time for our first break.
All right, so we'll take a break, and then we'll take our next step.
All right, see you in a minute.
All right, we're back.
Okay.
So we're factoring to extract some of these constants.
Yeah. Now, how do you feel about having test having its own constants versus using the test and the constants in the production code?
I think if they're shared across, like here, the 777, I feel like the test should use a constant in the production code.
Yeah.
If it was just a test and they just want to be consistent and you're using a bunch of them, then it would stay in the thing. But I feel like that duplication across, if that constant changed and the tests started failing and people are confused, that feels like the way to do it.
I go back and forth on that, partly because I'm in JavaScript a lot of the time and it doesn't have the concept of package protected variables. So if I expose something in my production code for the purpose of my tests using it, then it's also exposed as part of the public interface. And often, like this constant is not something we want to expose. It's very much an implementation detail.
Yeah.
But we can make it package protected and have our test access it just fine. But in JavaScript, it's either a local variable that nobody can see or it's public.
Right.
Unless you place shenanigans with, underscores and stuff like that.
Right.
Which I will do on occasion, but I'm never happy about it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if it had to be public, would my opinion change? I don't think so. I think I'd still have it shared because it is the same conceptual thing.
Yeah. I don't have a hard and fast rule on this. I kind of go back and forth. Sometimes I will put a constant in my test code and in my production code. And if one fails, then the other one just needs to be updated. And sometimes I will make it public and just say to myself, well, people shouldn't use this.
Right.
But I'm never neither one feels like a good solution.
Yeah. So let's turn this into a constant. Something like that.
I like that. I like using big, long variable names as a way of indicating, yeah, this is screwy and we know it.
Yeah. All right. And that'll be package local.
The only problem with that is that our tests might start getting weird because we're going to have to start using that in our tests.
Could always create an alias of basically a constant in the test that's assigned with the constant from the production code.
Yeah.
Which might actually be convenient because these are all I guess it doesn't matter. Numbers going to be same concatenation.
Yeah.
But let's do this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say let's extract this to a constant. And, oh, sure, I guess I'll replace all 5 occurrences. We'll make this private.
Where's the 5th one?
In our first test.
There it is.
And then basically delete that and then import it from the other place. And
Yeah,
voila.
that works for me. Yeah, I'm good with that.
It's not too bad.
Yeah, I'd probably call it just the one game ID.
Yeah, I think I might have been a bit hyperbolic there. There we go.
Or the only game ID.
Yeah, probably the only is better. The one true and only game.
The once and only game ID.
Yeah. There can only be one game ID. All right, that works.
We just need a Rock and Queen soundtrack. So
this didn't get pulled out.
Oh, that's weird.
That's interesting. So let's just do that.
Oh, that's because, yeah, no, that is weird.
It might have been that when I extracted it, I didn't check a checkbox. I don't know. Let's just make sure.
Dota, the original Highlander movie, which is the only Highlander movie they ever made, is a lot of fun. And it does have a Rock and Queen soundtrack.
All right. All our tests pass. And we have a single game ID.
Yeah. I kind of want the set ID to be after the white space, but I can see why you'd put it there also.
Yeah, somehow it feels like it's part of the creation of it.
Sure. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Let's check this in.
Yeah.
So my kids are teenagers now, and as part of their upbringing, their cultural upbringing, I've been showing them a bunch of 80s movies, like the original Terminator and Star Wars, of course, all the original Star Wars movies and so forth. I just realized Highlander would be a great movie to show them.
Oh yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I really like the Highlander TV series too.
So what do we do here? We just basically said,
yeah, we hard coded the game ID.
All right.
Okay. So I think this is a really good example of how thinking about air condition has forced us to really firm up our API.
It's funny how that happens.
Yeah, it really does.
It's really interesting that that really thinking about those other cases says, oh, there's something we're missing here.
Yeah. And that's something I love about test-driven development is it does make it easier for me to think about what are all the little edge cases. And then as you think about them, sometimes you're like, oh crap, now what? But a lot of the times you're just like, oh yeah, well actually what we need to do, but that's why I said this is like what we've done is 10% of the work. Because you do have to like tweak things and bring your API up to a higher level of standards. But I think that the code you produce with this is just so much higher quality than a code that only looks at FabbyPath. Yeah. Even if that code never did run its air conditions, I still feel like it's just the difference between it's the difference between a rickety table and one that's got good crossbars and tight screws, right? Both can hold stuff, but one isn't going to hold stuff forever. There's my second analogy for the day.
Yeah, and error conditions are part of the API.
Yeah,
and if you don't test them, then maybe your code is going to be super awkward and you're going to end up throwing exceptions when you really should just return a different kind of object.
Yeah.
And make everybody's lives miserable.
Let me add another test.
Then you're going to want to be in the test side.
So we write core game state, blah, 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 load scoreboard state. So what do we want it to do when we want to say that it does something when the game isn't found.
Mm-hmm.
When trying to load game that doesn't exist. I mean, you could make the case for in the future when we have support for multiple games, then we're going to return an option. And you could also make the case for doing that now, because it is absolutely true that the very, very first time that you run this, there will be no game.
Right.
So maybe that's what we want to do, is have it return option.
I think so. And this just proves what we were just talking about is like, oh, okay, we're going to have to return an optional.
Yeah.
And that changes the API.
It does. Yeah. It does. So before we do this, I wonder if we should modify our existing tests to have a helper method for loading the game.
A helper method for loading a game via SQL? I'm sorry, what do you mean?
No, just on line 123. We have load game.
Make that a helper method?
Yeah, and also we have it the same thing on 100.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I'm doing now that I didn't do as much before, and this is partly because I'm working in JavaScript where refactoring is much more of a pain than it is in Java, but I am making really liberal use of helper methods in my code. And so, for example, I'll have a load game and I'll have a save game that just turn around and call it game database.load game and, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And the reason I do that, one is it would allow us to combine, for example, line 94 and 100 into a single call. But yeah, this is signature shielding, Suiji. But the other reason I do this is for signature shielding. When we change the API, now rather than having to go back and change every test that runs call game or runs load game, we just change the helper method and modify that. Again, that's more of an issue in JavaScript where I can't easily change my method signatures. Here, if we want to change the method signature, we just do it and it will filter through.
Yeah.
So, but I do like that it would allow us to combine line 94 and 100. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm just so yeah, why are these down here?
That's actually connected to line 100, not line 97.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking. It's like, is that's set up or is that actions? So we can take it through this. And yeah, I'm good with that.
Okay.
So actually, I'm going to do that. And let's make it easier for IntelliJ to help us.
I think just lone game is what I would call it.
So we could either, and this is a preference thing, since game database JPA is a field, we could create it not as a static method, and then we don't have to pass any parameters.
I would prefer that. Yeah. We'll
just
pass as a static.
And then we can replace that one.
If we didn't have the Spring magic, then I would have that helper method like go out and fetch the game database JPA from wherever it resided, or do the JDBC stuff magic it needed to do.
Right. Okay, great. So that passes.
Okay. And we did that for both, right?
Yeah, because IntelliJ found the duplicate because we set it up that way. All right.
And we could do the same thing with save game. Or have, I don't know, what are we doing? What do our saves look like?
Well, we
Oh,
have
we
a
had
save
that
game.
already.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So that to me says we're on the right track.
Yeah.
So let's modify load game. Let's see, how do we want to do this?
Do we
Yeah,
not?
let's modify load game to return optional.
Yeah. Do we not just want to wrap it with an optional?
Yeah, Dodo, I don't think the signature shielding pattern is like a good pattern is actually something that a lot of people do. And you're just naming something that people do. And I don't think this idea of helper methods is particularly unique to me, but it is something that I found useful enough to include in the pattern language and give it a name.
All right. So that's the equivalent.
Okay. That should just work, right?
That should just work. All right.
Okay. And then can we return optional from load game as well?
It is. I basically did.
I meant on the left.
Oh, you want to, so then we can just do that. That.
I'm surprised that didn't automatically do that.
It didn't because I didn't set it up that way. So now we're assuming, well, actually, so here, I mean, in this test, we want to resolve the optional. So we don't want to actually assign it. We don't actually want to get the optional in this case.
No, I think it's just load game dot unwrap or whatever the appropriate thing is.
That's what I thought. So
we do want to return optional from the helper, but we want to unwrap it in our test.
Right.
Yeah. There we go.
And this is kind of bugging me, so
is that inspection bothering you?
Yeah, then it really is bothering me because it's also interfering with being able to hit F2 to go from error to error. Suppress for class. Okay, there we go. Great. Okay. Let's see. That should still work. Yeah, we're going to do something with the or else 3G. I'm not worried about the warning. I was worried about the errors.
Okay, so now I think we can write our test. There we go. Yeah, so let's call it I mean, it just returns
So
what's the not found branch of the optional called?
Well, it can either throw an exception or we can return a default.
Yeah, well, oh, because it's an optional.
Right. So there you can either do or else throw and it will throw an exception, or you can say or else basically return an actual default game. Yeah, or we could just query if it's empty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Load game is empty when game doesn't exist. Back to you. Thanks.
So we'll just do okay. I'll set that shot is empty. So this will throw an exception, is the way it's currently configured. Because we're throwing an exception here. Which is actually
no, this is failing correctly. We've gotten the test to fail. Now we need to implement it.
Yeah.
So is game table an optional? Is that what's happening there?
Find by ID is an optional, and so we can actually propagate that. So if we do extract this into a method, which is snapshot from table, then we can do turn and map snapshot from table. I think that's right. Yep.
Perfect.
That's what I love about optionals. All right.
Okay. I'm just thinking about that name, snapshot from table. We say from persisted scoreboard and from persisted hand. Should we say from persisted game?
Yes. Oh, Dodo, you're asking about sort of the ordering of test methods. It's interesting. I go back and forth around, do you sort of write the outcome first in the test method name, or do you think about it given when then? I'll go both ways, and often I'll start with the more explicit this, then, given this, and hopefully drop the given part when this happens. But sometimes it's like, what do we care about? Do we care about the thing that we're executing, or do we care about the outcome? And so I go back and forth. I'm kind of inconsistent about it.
I don't think it matters particularly. Like I'm not going to get upset if we decide to change this to when game does not exist, load game is empty. These days, because I'm working with sort of a BDD style testing frameworks, they have describe blocks and it statements.
Right.
And I prefer that over the suite and testing language, even though I don't love BDD as a sort of overarching philosophy. I find that it's a little bit overwrought. But I do like just the phrasing that comes out of saying describe and it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll say describe loading, and then I'll say it is empty when game does not exist.
Right.
And so I put the when clause after because my tests are written something or other.
Right.
So, and I'll see something like this, or like load game is empty, and I'm like, actually, I've got a whole concept here which is about loading, and I'll put that in a describe block.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that comes from.
Yep. All right. So that's when the game does not exist.
So let's look at. I think the scoreboard is actually not, and that's a happy path. That's something that can happen normally, but let's go ahead and implement that. If there is no scoreboard, we should just get a default scoreboard, right?
Should we? I guess this is what if we have a game.
We'll scroll up a little bit. Let's look at our test that loads the scoreboard.
That's right. So it's load scoreboard.
Yeah. So the scoreboard is stored in the database as rows in the game's scoreboards table. So if we create a new game, and we have not yet rolled any dice, then we will have a game with no game scoreboard rows.
Right. Somehow I was thinking that an empty list would actually be stored, but of course, no, it wouldn't.
Yeah. And I'm not even sure if we need to test that because I feel like it's kind of covered at this point.
Yeah. So then no scoreboard exists.
That's just normal state.
Yeah, that's just the new game. Is there something about and this is probably more around corruption than this is a scoreboard that exists, but it's for not for the one game ID.
I think purely for the purpose of documenting this, I do want to say something along the lines of scoreboard is empty when no game scoreboard rows exists. And so this is where I like my string-based tests. And that is a perfectly normal. I would want to just put this in for the purposes of documentation. I don't know if you like that. If you don't like that test name, I'm fine with changing it. But I do like the idea of just saying, hey, we've said that the game row does what happens when the game row doesn't exist. If I'm reading these tests, my first thought is going to be, oh, but what about the game scoreboard rows? And it's nice to have it just in there so I don't end up spending time trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that from a documentation standpoint, that is good because otherwise, like I had to go through that thought process a little bit, and having a test save me that effort would be good. But I am troubled by the name.
Sure, go ahead and change it.
I think it's. So how are we going to verify this? We're going to...
Well, I think what we're going to do is basically what we have up on line. We're going to repeat that test, except that we are going to just look at the scoreboard. Actually, no, it's already in there. Line 106 is doing exactly what we've got. What we're talking about doing. Like it's the exact same test.
Oh yeah, it is.
Because we created a game row.
Right, because we created the game, we created only the game row. Yeah. All right. So then,
yeah, I think this test is probably redundant.
Yeah.
All right. So let's think about corruption. Can we put not nulls on the hibernate so that we cannot write? I'll let you finish this thought.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So now we need to get into really, truly corrupted data. The first thing that comes to mind is we've got columns that don't have data that they're supposed to have. Can we put constraints on the database using Hibernate annotations to just make that impossible?
Probably.
Yeah. Do we want to test that? I mean, we could test it by trying to insert data that was bad data and something like this. If I can, we could write a test that was along these lines. Database constraints prevent invalid or null data from being written to database. And we could say something like execute a query that was insert blah, blah, blah values.
Right, with some
blah, 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 null.
Right.
and then say assert exception. That's awfully. We could do that. I don't know if we want to.
So what is this scenario that that our app inserted nulls, or that somebody else inserted nulls?
This is forcing us to add a not null constraint to the database, which presumably we do.
Oh, okay.
With a hibernate annotation. Or
yeah.
can we even do that?
I'm pretty sure we can do that. How to do it, I don't know offhand. What I'm looking at is just what is it generating. Constraint. Yeah, I mean, I think by default, they're all not null.
Yeah, in that case, I don't think we need to.
Yeah.
I'm always torn, like, especially when you have magic, you can create fairly substantial behaviors with just an annotation or something. And I won't always test that, I'll be honest. I'll just put them in because I'm like, yep, it needs to be in there. It's in there. But it always makes me feel a little bit queasy because those could be changed in the future and break stuff without me knowing it.
Yeah, I mean, what's sort of non-realistic is we're relying on Hibernate to generate the schema, and generally you wouldn't do that. You'd you'd actually write the schema and you'd put the not nulls in, and so then the question is would you write a test to make sure that schema definition included the not null? But I think you can still then put annotations, even though you're defining the schema externally, that would fail to validate when it loads it and sees it's null.
Yeah.
90% sure that's possible.
So I think let's skip this test then.
Yeah.
So you can delete that pseudocode I added. So I'm just trying to go through and think to myself, what are all the different ways the data could be corrupted? One is putting invalid data into a database row. Actually looking at the test, does it add a foreign key constraint on our game scoreboard table?
It must, because that's how it does it, but let's see. Did I close it? Close it. All right.
Luigi, I think that's okay in this case. There's a constraint.
Yeah.
Add constraint, unique.
And then, yeah.
Foreign key, there it is. Scroll down just a little bit further.
Yeah, foreign key references game DBO. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's
your old code.
Oh, that's for current hand.
Yeah, game DBO is all your old
Here it
stuff.
is. Game scoreboard, foreign key constraint, game table ID. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So I think we can trust Hibernate to do its job.
Yeah.
So I think that leaves us with the only possible data corruption here being that we've got multiple rows with the same game ID and score category. I can't think of anything else. Can you?
I'm trying to figure out how that would happen either.
Oh, I have thought of some other bad data situations.
Because this is expressed as a map of string to string. So if this entry is the same, the map is only going to have one entry for that key.
Well, again, it's somebody screwing up the database.
Yeah, so if it's right, so if it's somebody inserting it on their own outside of this code, then yes, we would have to protect against that.
I've got a couple of other corrupted cases.
Mm-hmm.
Invalid serialization of hand of dice.
Sure.
Invalid category,
Mm-hmm.
score category.
Right, because we're not using another table for score categories.
Right.
That could happen. Yep.
Is it just a string?
Yeah, it's just a string.
Okay. We had talked about using multiple tables for that,
yeah.
but we didn't.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah.
Yeah, and so there are two places that serialization happens. One is in the current hand, and one is in the hand for the score category.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's start out with that first one, the duplicate scoreboard entries.
All right. So it's going to look a lot like this test.
Yeah.
What do we want to happen? Should it just throw an exception?
Yeah, I think you should throw an exception. And then it's the application logics, and I checked exception. And then it's the application logics job. So we could do it functionally and make it like an optional and have it have load gain return an error type. But I don't think that's a normal thing in Java, is it?
Yeah, no, that's not typical.
Yeah, I think checked exception is the Java way to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's throw an exception.
Actually, it's not. Rows, same score category. Is that right?
I'm going to keep our to-dos together.
So here we're going to say it's fours. So we expect that this is going to be a problem. So we're going to...
So go ahead and run that. That should still pass.
Unless it automatically set up.
Yeah, unless it puts some sort of constraint.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It actually
constraint
did.
violation. So it knows that the map can't.
Yeah, because the way it does the collection table is it uses this as, and I think maybe Suiji mentioned that.
Yeah.
That it created the combined primary key for the game ID plus the score category.
Okay, well that's good. Do we want to keep this as just proof?
I think so. So we should expect this to throw an exception. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, no, I don't think that's the right test name. I think the right test name is something along the lines of database constraints prevent. Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, this is what I was getting at with this is how we could have tested the not null, is by basically trying to insert null and then asserting that we got an exception.
Violation exception.
Yeah, we don't actually care because we're just documenting the way the database behaves.
Okay, so I'll use what it actually throws. Whoops. We renamed the test so it didn't run. Where did that? Oh, it was a persistence exception.
Oh, persistent exception. Oh, it wrapped the constraint violation exception. Got it.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, it's such fun with wrapped exception. All right.
So I think all we really need to do is test the case where we've got bad data, like bad, poorly serialized data.
Yeah, the only other thing I could think of is if a number was out of range for rolls. I don't know if hibernate. I think we could attach I don't know if you would attach a constraint like must be between 0 and 2.
So let me write another test. Let's say that we want to say it throws exception when current hand is, well, we've got a bunch of things we could say here. Incorrect number of dice, dice out of range, dice not integers. And I think we're going to want to do all of those. But to sort of start us off gradually, let's say that it throws an exception when score category doesn't exist.
Ah, right. Okay.
And I actually, it might be smart enough to, I'm not sure what's going to happen here. So let's just run this and see what happens. Because it knows that it's a, it knows it's an enum, so it might be doing some smart stuff under the covers.
Well, the game table does not know it's an enum.
Right. So we should be able to insert.
Yeah. So fine. This should be able to be, but we need to actually insert.
Oh, right.
All right. So we expect that to be fine. And it is.
Yeah. So when we do a load game, can I run this,
yep.
Type this again? When we do a load game, we should see something. We're going to run just load game here. And then I think we want to do our own database exception, which is going to be a game corrupted exception. And we'll just throw that same exception for everything. And I think on the UI, what we'll do is when we get a game corrupted exception, we'll just have to tell the user, sorry, your game is gone forever. Sucks to be you.
Please contact customer support.
Are we charging enough to have customer support?
Oh, no, we'll use ChatGPT to handle the customer support.
Yes, I can see that your game is corrupted because games get corrupted in this system.
All right, let's go create that.
We'll have its hallucinate a solution for us.
Come on, there we go. And
game corrupted or game corruption? I think game corrupted.
Yeah, I think it's something that happened. And something that I've been doing is actually dropping the word exception.
Hmm.
Um,
That's very unidiomatic.
yes, it's one of the few things where I'm like, no, like Kevlin Henning says, like, duh, of course it's an exception because it's being thrown or being caught. So of course, what else could it be?
I love the way that reads, but I cannot agree with it because it's so unidiomatic that people are going to look at it and they're like, what's going on here? Like, yeah, that exception word is redundant, but there's nothing in Java that does it this way, as far as I know.
There's nothing in the libraries that do that. But I actually did this in my ensembler code, and it becomes I think you get used to it pretty quickly, because if we look at it sort of in context, here it's clear it's an exception. You throw a new one.
I mean, I hear you, and I know that people will look at this and be like, how come that's not an exception? But I'm not going to fight you over it. Because honestly, I do like it a lot better.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, it's
I wouldn't do it.
Usually, I almost bend over backwards to be like, I'm not gonna rename things that are idiomatic. I'll call stuff controller. I'll still call stuff service sometime. Most of the time, I'll call stuff. But there are some things that, because they're not classes that you interact with, and so it feels like these little pieces that you need that are, you don't pay much. There's no sort of behavior. Those are the ones I feel comfortable. But
yeah, all right, let out your inner iconoclast.
So
I know you've been wanting to. You're right, though. This is a real surprise because you have been like very idiomatic all the way along.
Yeah. Are we going to want a message or?
Yeah, I think just hard code a message though. No. Either we have a message or we have like a million special cases. Like we can have a invalid game. See, now this is where having exception at the end would be nice. We could have game corrupted be the overarching exception and then have a bunch of little type subclasses of exception. Personally, I'd probably just use a message though.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're gonna in code need to tell the difference, I certainly wouldn't start there.
Yeah.
That would be something I'd refactor to, where it's like, oh, this is more precise type, and then propagate that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So let me flip this over here. Let's start here, and then if we need more, we'll add it. So what are we saying here? Throws exception when score category. So we got no such. Okay, so this is certainly not going to throw an exception, or at least certainly not this type of exception. What is it actually going to do? So when it from persistent hand,
I think it will definitely blow up when the enum hits, but whether or not Hibernate will catch that before the enum hits, or whether it's just going to be the enum creation that
it's going to basically fail right here when it tries to reconstitute the enum. So it'll be whatever Java's value of does. So let's run it. So basically, illegal argument exception.
Okay. Yeah. So let's. What are we going to do? Are we going to intercept illegal argument exception inside of score category dot value of?
For starters,
is there a way at runtime for us to tell if a string is within the enum valid enum types?
Well, the way you check is you basically do score category I mean, you pretty much either try to do a value of and it'll fail, or you can look at the values and search through them and see if it exists.
Okay. Let's start out by factoring out score category value of
Yeah.
to from persisted score category.
That was my, this is, whoops, what? So this is going to be persisted score category.
To paraphrase Pellet, Ted, what you've done here is you've nailed your manifesto to the church door with your exception naming.
See, what I get to do is I get to appeal to authority and just say, well, Kevlin Henney said, and that's it. And I'm like absolved.
Right. What did Kevlin Henney say?
He has a whole talk on where this is part of his talk about sort of naming things and like going against like using superfluous prefixes and suffixes. Like, look, we don't use Hungarian notation anymore because we have types. So let's not sort of do the same kind of thing with our Java code or with our code in general. All right, so we've extracted that out, and so we can.
I think just wrapping it is the best thing to do here.
So we'll throw. Do we want to wrap the exception when we do our incorrupted?
I don't think that's necessary in this case.
I don't either. Now, this gets. So we created as a checked exception, and I was going to suggest that we don't do that. And this is the reason. Exceptions in the context of streams is really kind of messy.
Oh, God.
And in fact, sort of the way I approach exceptions is I no longer use checked exceptions because sort of the meaningfulness of it has gone away.
Oh man, it kills me to use a runtime exception here because it is a check. It is an actual example of this should be a checked exception. So what happens if we?
Well, actually, it might not be so bad.
Yeah, I mean, let's just put it. Can we just do a throws on from scoreboard, or what's this going to do to us?
So we would have to. We can't wrap it at this level.
We'd have to do it at the from persisted scoreboard level.
Yes. So we could say throws game corrupted, but that doesn't help because
right.
This is at a different level, and this is sort of the downside of the way streams and exceptions interact.
Yeah, I mean, Java is missing another declaration type, which is just that it forwards all exceptions is what it needs to be able to say without making it. Yeah, I mean, it's just checked exceptions were a great idea, but they really fall down in this case, or they fall down in a lot of cases, to be honest. All right, if you want to make it a runtime exception, I'll buy it. It kills me though.
Well, I mean, we could basically say, never mind here.
Right? And just do it up there.
And basically wrap the entire...
Yeah, let's do that.
So we can just, let's see, surround.
The other option would be to throw a runtime internally and then unwrap it and turn it into a checked exception at our interface. That's pretty weird.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, what's going to happen here is we're going to need to throw different exceptions for different scenarios, different exception messages for different scenarios, and that could get ugly.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and do it this way for now.
Let's see if that'll even... Actually, let's see if that even works. So... that. And then throw...
Yeah, Pixie, I
Yeah.
like that idea.
And this no longer does that. What was Pixie's idea? Oh, yeah. Right, now this has to be propagated. Yeah, so
It gets messy, gets super messy, but I really want it to be a checked exception. I just feel like that is the proper API here. Um, what I like about the pellet is that it is impossible for us to misuse load game. Like it is so common to because people don't think about errors, it's so common to call a method that has genuine error conditions that could happen and not realize it. And checked exceptions forces you to be aware of the errors that can happen. I prefer the functional programming approach of having a okay or error type of response because I think that's cleaner and resolves a lot of the stuff we're having here when you've got good types throughout your system supporting that. But if we're not going to throw a checked exception, then I want to do something else to say, an error could occur here. Really, we've got 3 return types. We've got found it and everything's fine. Didn't find it, but that's okay.
mhm.
And
Yeah,
broke.
and this is where yeah, so I think our two because this is not going to work the way we're with the checked exception. So
Well, Pixie does say that using a runtime internally and then unwrapping and rewrapping at the lighter boundary is not just something I've made up. So that is an option for us.
okay, so I think our 2 options then are do that.
Mm-hmm.
So let the runtime exception flow through the stream stuff, and then catch it here because this is at the public interface, and then rethrow the checked exception here. That's probably the more straightforward way. The other way is replace optional with result or return, some algebraic data type, kind of thing where it's
That
either the snapshot it's empty or error.
Yeah, but I think that doesn't solve the problem. What do we do internally? Because even if we return an algebraic data type at the
I think
edge,
either way we have to throw. I think we can't throw a checked exception internally.
Yeah. So it's time for our second break. So
Yep.
maybe we'll mull this over.
That sounds
y'all
good.
in chat, maybe you can come up with something better, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Yep. All right, we're back.
Okay. I gotta say, Ted, I love that we're having this conversation. Like, this is exactly why I want to do air handling, right? Is to force these sorts of things to come out.
Yeah. So I got to be honest. I don't use checked exceptions in code. I just don't. And it's frustrating. And I totally agree that the exception is part of the interface, and so it should be part of the literal interface. But I have to agree with Pellet. I've just seen in practice nobody knows what to do with it, and they basically just catch it and rethrow something else, or catch it in log or something like that, and that all the benefit is lost, and it's really frustrating. And
well, I think the streams demonstrate how problematic they are, because you can't create a sort of high level function that uses a function that has a checked exception without, like, there's no way to implement that higher level function with the Java semantics as they currently exist, as far as I know. And so you can't construct functions out of functions that throw checked exceptions.
Right.
But I think for us, for load game, that's an okay scenario. But either way, we've got to get the exception out from persistent scoreboard. So we should decide. I think we have 3 options here. One, throw a runtime exception and just propagate it. Two, so at our interface, we can either throw a runtime exception, we can throw a checked exception, or we can return an algebraic data type that is either that it has three conditions:
Right.
found, not found, or blah.
Okay.
I'm kind of opposed to algebraic data type because it's not very idiomatic and it seems like a lot of work to create. But in any other language, I'd be like, yeah, that's a no-brainer. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Well, not any other language.
A language that already had it supported, yes.
Yeah, but any functional programming
Right.
language or even semi-functional programming language like Java, or JavaScript, it would be a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I don't know about C#. They're a little more functional, but I haven't gotten into the functional characteristics of C#.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know I've seen them use result stuff, but I'm not sure how much that. Yeah, I don't know enough about the idiomatic C#.
So I think just because it's not the Java way, it really comes down to runtime exception or checked exception. I love checked exceptions for their ability to expose the need for error handling. And I think implementing it is actually not that difficult. We have an internal game corruption error, which is a unchecked exception, and then we catch at the interface level and load game.
Mm-hmm.
And then immediately, just unwrap and turn into a checked exception.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you have more current experience with Java than I do, Ted. And so I'm willing to defer to you on just returning the runtime. But I think the amount of work is roughly equivalent for either one. So it's really a design question, I think, more than a pragmatic implementation difficulty question.
So I'm thinking, yeah, no, it's like, so there's part of me that's like, hey, we could say game corrupted is the internal exception, then game corrupted exception is the external checked one, because that's not confusing. So I think I like throwing a checked exception here.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be game corrupted.
Yeah.
Because you're asking it to load game, and boom, I can't even load. I can't even say there's no game because it's just corrupted.
Somebody who calls load game needs to immediately deal with the fact that we have a game a corrupted game.
Yeah.
Like, we could return the not found. We could return an empty optional, but that's destroying valuable information. Now the interface will not be able to make a distinction between you never had a game and the game was corrupted. And we've all experienced interfaces like that. I tried to load the game and I know I saved it and it's not there anymore.
Right.
Like, well, yeah, I don't like that.
And so then, where is it? Here, we're not going to throw it because that's going to be the runtime version. And so here, actually, we're going to.
I think we should put, if we're going to use a runtime, we should go all the way back down to from persistent score category.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yep. And so then this would go back to wrapping this with. So the question is, what exception do we throw here?
I was thinking internal game corrupted, or game corrupted runtime, or see, now this is where not having exception on the end gets a little awkward.
Well, what's the cause of this is score category not known, or unknown score category, because that's really the problem at this level.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going back to a different type of, but because this is not public, I was just thinking one generic exception for all the different corruptions that we could have, and then we'd unwrap that at the higher level.
So would we throw then? So then the unknown score category might be something that the consumer sees, or
let me
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're getting at.
yeah. So what I'm imagining is we throw a game corruption internal
You can throw exception there on the end. I know you want to.
exception. um,
Yeah.
and then up here in load game, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it's no. You see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. So, is this ed or?
I think it should be ed.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is game corrupted. So I'll go ahead and create that.
And that we could do as even an internal class because it's not used anywhere outside of this.
Oh yeah.
I like that too, Pellet. Pixie, I'm not sure what you're getting at there.
So this is the internal. Hold
on. Just to answer your questions earlier, Pixie, about the business case, what we're implementing as persistence, we haven't gotten, we're doing this sort of bottom up rather than top down. So we don't have anything that's using this code yet. But ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to have something in our application layer that's going to be saving and loading the games. Yeah, we'll refactor if necessary, Pixie.
Okay, so that's that. Sure. Actually, I like the symmetry. So that does not throw. That is that. And we'll create that constructor. Okay. So I think that's where we are.
Yeah. So that should pass our test now, right?
Now we need to propagate that exception here. I'm going to just say throws exception. And what else is wrong? Oh, right now all our tests need to. Okay. Now we're good. And yes, now that should pass. Yep. You know, it's funny you mentioned that pellet. I used to use Infinite Test as well. I have not found a replacement for it. And I have adopted, in some cases, a background script that does a watch on files, and then basically runs the Maven and actually does actually a commit for you if it passes and code's changed. What I'm waiting for is there's an open UTrack issue for IntelliJ, where in the run configuration you can specify things that happen before the test run. It would be nice if there was an after condition, because then you could basically just say run infinitely and then do stuff if tests pass or fail. I have been playing with a plugin at the JUnit level for monitoring tests and basically doing the file watch thing. But yeah, it'd be nice to have a proper plugin. Yeah, why does Rider have it built in and IntelliJ doesn't? I don't know. I have to see if there's an open issue on that. Cool. Would you like me to fix that test, or are you going to fix it?
Go for it. My my IDE is still a little bit not as smooth as it should be, just because of something about using code together. So happy for you to type that in. So the thinking I have here, for everybody listening, is whenever I'm creating an exception message, I'm assuming two things. One, it's not going to show up in the user interface, and two, it is going to show up in my logs. And when it shows up in my logs, I'm going to have my hair on fire because the system is down in some way. And so I want it to be like super explicit. I want to say exactly why it's happening and where. And the stack trace gives us some of the where, but this makes it a little bit easier to see. And also I want to put in all the data that will help somebody debug it. Right. So like the no such category, which Ted had already done. But what I added here was the when loading game, which I think just gives a little more context for somebody skimming through the logs trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I don't know what I would have done that, because that's what threw the exception.
Yeah.
The only thing I might add, although it's only known at the load game or other level, is when we have multiple games, is which ID is it or something like that. But
yeah. Actually, yeah, and we won't have that in from persisted score category.
Right.
I will actually pass parameters in to my functions purely to make my exceptions more readable.
Yeah, in this case, it's multi-level deep, so I'd probably, when I might even know that this is internal, that it's going to be wrapped, and then when we do this part, I would stick in the ID. Here's the context, and then here's the specifics.
Yeah. Something I do with logs that I've never seen anybody else do is I've got this idea of binding logs. So I have a function, a method I put on my log where I say log.bind, and that returns a new instance of a logger that will automatically add whatever, and I also use structured logs, right? So whichever parameters I've put in that bind will automatically be included in every log that uses this new logger that's been returned. So when I come into something like this, I'll take the log and I'll bind all the data. Like this is the ID, often it's for HTTP calls. So here's the endpoint I'm calling, here's blah, blah, blah. I'll bind that. Then I can pass the logger down through to all my various other functions. And when they use that logger, they're using the bound logger that has all the data I need to provide context for the log.
Yep.
It's, I don't know if that comes across clearly, but it's in the example code for the nullables.
Yeah.
So.
No, that's really nice. I hadn't thought about that. I tend to, the last company I worked at basically was switching over to more metrics. And so a lot of people treat the output of logs as metrics, and instead of just writing metrics directly. And so instead of treating it as just some serialized output that then you then have to search and summarize later, writing specific things out is like, here's what happened and here's the entire context, and it's not even a log anymore. And then you do get that sort of nested, decorated kind of thing happening partially for you if you have the right setup, framework setup.
Yeah, I'm not an ops guy, so I'm not really up on what all the latest and greatest, what do they call it? Transparency? No, that's not it.
Observability.
Know this.
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Observability.
Yeah, I'm not up on the latest observability tools, but I do know there's a lot of conversations about structured logs versus sort of the classic unstructured Apache logs, and traceability and so forth.
Yeah.
But a sort of poor man's version of that, poor person's version of that, is just write a logging wrapper that outputs a string but takes a map. Of course, that's nicer in languages that allow you to just create maps very easily.
Right.
But that's a really simple way to implement structured logging that I quite like.
All right. Okay, so we've got at least invalid score categories done.
Yeah. So what's next? So we can take out duplicate scoreboard entries exist. We can take, so I guess it's these three cases that remain. So do you think we can knock them out in the next 30 minutes?
So. Yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
So,
so I don't think we need to test every possible case where, like, the combinatorial explosion of the ways hand of dice can go wrong. We've got a single from persisted hand that we use in both the scoreboard and the game. So I think we can just write the three cases that we have here, sort of the simple way, by putting it into the game row rather than into the game scoreboard category row, or the game scoreboard row.
So you're saying, so basically, because we have this serialized here, the thing that
we don't need to worry about deserializing.
We don't, because it's the same code. Yeah,
it's the same code.
Yep.
I don't know how you talk about this with your folks when you're teaching, but I talk about you want to write tests you want to write black box tests using white box thinking to guide you. So when I decide, my tests are all written black box. The tests are unaware of the implementation. But when I decide which test to write, I'm thinking about how is the code actually implemented, or how it's actually going to be implemented.
Yeah.
I don't treat the code that I'm testing as, anything could happen. I say, no, I've got this code and I'm worried about these things going wrong.
Right. Yeah, that's where I talk about let the code guide your tests. And to me, that's, test-driven development is you're not just top down, outside in, just writing tests. You're looking at the implementation and you're seeing, I'm missing this, so let me go write a test for this. This, like you said, it's like, there's only one method that does this, so write it this way.
Yeah. And that is different. Like a proper QA department, if they're doing black box testing, they're unaware of the implementation and they are exhaustively testing all the possibilities.
Yeah.
So I say black box testing with white box thinking, which is completely opaque to the people I explain it to. Like they have no idea what I mean.
Yeah.
So I like the way you're describing it better.
So Suiji brings up something that just came to mind for me is we're testing this through the database, but really, would you just say, well, look, I actually have this code and I might push all of these, and we've talked about this before, sort of these from persisted, I'd push those into a transformer or translator object that then, given this, should have this output without involving the database because it's just the serialization, deserialization.
I think that's a really good point because this is no longer database specific.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think we are actually exposing the need for the transformer that you like.
Yeah.
And I think what it comes down for me is how many of these are we going to write? Um, and a little bit of that is laziness. I'm like, we're almost there. Let's just finish it. Uh, let's.
I mean, we could just do it the way it is because to extract out the transformer would take a little bit of work. We could say, let's finish this and then extract it out. And I think that would be interesting because we may find that we then retarget our tests, is what I call it. It's like we were testing through the database and grabbing it out, but now we're just pulling out the database. Now we have a new class we're testing directly against as an isolated test, and then we no longer need the other tests.
Yeah. I mean, the score category does not exist that one doesn't bother me as much, but now that we're getting into the dice and we've got lots of little nitpicky things,
right,
that is starting to bother me a little bit. Yeah. But it's only 3. I think if it was 20, then absolutely. And if it was 1, I'd be like, absolutely not. 3 is like, it's close, but I'm lazy and I don't like lots of files. So it's probably okay. That's sort of where my brain is at right now.
Yeah. I mean, we could take the middle ground, which is what Svg suggests, is, well, these from persisted, we could just make them.
That to me is more of a smell than what we're doing it either the other.
Yeah, I kind of don't that to me that's a slippery slope of exposing these when they're not really part of its part of its interface.
Let me toss some things down and see what happens. Because I think we can write these really quick, and I think then we can come back and look at it. But yeah, so do we care about these? So now we're starting to see the need for some sort of insert helper, I guess.
Right. Mm-hmm. But we don't need to insert in the scoreboard, right? Because we're not even checking that.
Right. Yeah, so that can just come out.
Yeah. So by the way, you just did something that I always warn against in my ensembles, is don't copy everything from the previous test. Like,
I do that all the time.
Figure out what you want.
All the time.
Yeah. And so what I often see happen is you end up with more setup than you actually need. So I'm pretty particular about what is it I actually need. And being a bit more thoughtful about what do I need for this specific test. Because I find it, and I'll copy and paste stuff, but I think I'm a bit more like, what's the minimum I need to copy as opposed to just copying the whole thing.
I will do it the way I just did it, but I usually do look at it pretty closely to make sure I didn't overcopy. But also, I will only do that a couple of times before I extract it out.
Yeah.
So my next, actually, you heard me say that as I copied it. Right. Now we need to start to factor this out.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I used to be really allergic to cut and paste because I thought it gave me good discipline to create my refactorings. I've gotten less dogmatic about that, but I still take that signal of copying and pasting to be, I'm going to get it to work now, but then I know I've got to fix it down the road.
Right. And what I've seen those, which is why I'm a bit more careful about how much I'm copying, is if you copy too much and you think that you need to refactor all of that, you may end up refactored and put sort of, in a box that you don't look at, that there's actually too much going on in there.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think we're both trying to accomplish the same thing, and I think that's good. I think that's actually really good guidance for people. I don't personally find it to be a problem, but I'm pretty disciplined about looking at the code I copy and paste.
So we expected that to throw.
Yeah, so has the wrong number of dice. Do you want me to implement that?
Well, I'm wondering why it didn't complain at all.
Well, from persisted hand.
Because we returns a list of integers. We just split it and return a list of integers. Yeah. Hand of dice, though.
Hand of dice is probably missing.
Hand of dice is missing an invariant check.
Mm-hmm.
So what's really interesting is this specific situation. Like I would have exactly the scenario of like I would have expected. Why is somebody allowing the non? Okay, we're parsing it, but somebody should have enforced somewhere and thrown an exception somewhere that this was actually illegal. And I find this really interesting because I've really ramped up how much I think about invariants and precondition checks in my object code to make them really, and we talked about this a bit before, like that's really the fail fast, is fail early, fail somewhere, and make it obvious that, oh, this is not even a legal hand of dice.
Yeah. So I think of invariants as runtime assertions. They're for the programmer, and I don't write tests around them. Do you agree with that?
I agree with the first part.
I do put a test at our deserialization logic, but I wouldn't put a test around handofdice.from.
I would.
You would? Interesting.
Yeah, because normally I'm test driving it, and I want to make sure that I've captured the condition for which the precondition doesn't hold. Because to me, that's a not happy scenario.
Yeah. That's just, I think, a difference in the way we approach it. Is I think the code should work, that the invariant the runtime exception, or the runtime assertion, that's just so the code will fail fast. Like the behavior is the same. I think that if you're ever calling this such that the invariant is triggered, the runtime assertion is triggered, you as the caller have done something wrong. So I'm just putting the assertion in there to help you out, to sort of guide you into that pit of success. And I'm using so many of them. Like I put them very liberally through my code, that writing tests on every single one gets really, it doesn't affect the correctness of the code I'm writing, only the correctness of the code callers write. And I write so many of these runtime assertions that putting tests around them really makes my tests very noisy. So that's how I've rationalized to myself that I don't put tests around it, because the code is equally correct with or without these invariants.
Yeah, I mean my rationale is they're often at least sometimes non-trivial precondition checks where
that's not true for me. They're almost always trivial for me.
Yeah, so for me here, just checking that as the right number, I will probably write that correctly, but I'd want to test that. I want to drive that through a test, and then precondition checks are not just for like, is this valid input, but it's also the invariant of the object as a whole, and that you might have several of those for a method, that an operational method. Is there enough money in the account? Have you exceeded number of transactions you can do? All these kinds of things. And
I think we're talking about things that are related, but actually a little bit different. You're talking about invariants, and I'm talking about fail fast assertions. And
so I'll do them as requires clauses where it'll throw an exception immediately. But there are different levels of sort of, am I checking just inputs, or am I checking also the state of the object? Maybe that's the difference.
Yeah. Well, because we're running out of time, let's make this test pass. Let's put adding hand of dice invariants on the
to-do,
on the backlog.
Hey, Tramstars. So we're going to...
I think what happened was we actually factored out hand of dice during some of our other work, and so we didn't do it quite as thoroughly as we would have if we weren't in the middle of something else.
Well, hand of dice always existed. We just renamed it.
Is that
but
what it was?
when I originally factored it out, I didn't put it in that invariant. Because never had bad data. Never could have had bad data because
Right.
it wasn't getting anything from the outside world
Right.
for the most part. So, yeah, let's see if integers, size. This feels weird doing this check here because that 5 is knowledge that the hand of dice should know. Row new.
Sorry, why is this weird here?
Testing for 5. It's like, where's 5? What does that mean? Who knows?
Yeah, it's sort of a magic number.
Yeah.
And it's a domain number.
It's a domain number, yeah. So what are we throwing? We're throwing a
game corrupted internal exception.
Yeah. And let's throw that for now. So this will fail on the message. Yep. And then we'll just take that. And plus,
I think we want the original, the hand of dice.
Oh yeah, just. Yep. All right.
Okay. Let me add another test for you.
Yep.
Since this is a string coming into us, I'm not. This will probably fail because of the type conversion.
Yeah, because we're doing a value of assuming. I would really want to know what is this person who's writing this bad data thinking of? Where are they getting that 1.5? Oh, I thought it was supposed to be the average of dice or something. Yeah, okay.
Actually, we don't. I wonder if we should check for just. I think this will handle the same case as.
Yeah, because we'll probably need to do something around. Is integer something like that?
No, I think it will just throw in. Well, let's see what happens here.
Yeah, so here's a number format exception. So I think anything that is not an integer will fail appropriately.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and make this pass, and then we can just do a little desk check where we or not a desk check, but we can just do a little quick change it to an X, see if it still works, and if it does, I don't think we need another test.
So whoops.
So that's the value of that's throwing the exception at us, right?
Yeah.
So can we just wrap this whole thing in a try catch?
Yep. So we'll throw section.
You got 2 news there.
Oops. And there, this is just going to be.
Speaking of things that make me nervous, that cut and paste makes me nervous because I have definitely had cases where I've done that and then forgot to change it. Forgot to.
Yeah, I as I was copying it, I'm like, that's too much. Nice.
Catching every possible exception here, I feel goes too far.
Oh yeah, I shouldn't. I agree. That was me not paying attention to the automated refactoring. All right.
Okay. Let's just quickly change this to an X and see the test fail in the appropriate way. Yep, that's fine. And then you want to answer Zan while
Yeah.
I do this?
If we're going to assert the error message with has message, one accept package private constant. Here I don't think the constant is useful. And I personally I tend not to use constants, like even though we have like the only game ID, I tend not to use constants in my tests because I want them to be, unless they're things that are not important, but things that are important, I want them to be literally right in the test. And so because somebody could change the constant and the test passes, but maybe that's bad that the constant changed. So there's, sort of the don't repeat yourself, I think is overemphasized, especially with constants.
What I will do though is, for example, we are repeating ourselves a little bit on the right, and then we're repeating ourselves on the left.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes what I'll do is I'll say something like assert invalid dice error,
Right,
and then I'll have the has message just implemented once there, but I still will have a separate implementation of the error in the test and versus the production code.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to change the test name.
Yep.
As out of bounds dice. Dice that are too large. And since there's going to be two clauses on our if statement, I'm going to make one for too small as well. And because of off by one errors, I'm going to do that exactly. One too much and one too little.
Yep. Yeah, one of the things I'm always emphasizing is and this is looking at the code as transparent as opposed to opaque, is that what are the boundaries in your code? What is if there's code already in there? What is on the on the right side of that equals or greater than sign?
What's the correct annotation here to skip a test?
Disabled.
Okay. You want to make that first one pass?
Okay, so the first one is about dice that are too large. So pull this out. That's a horrible name, but I'm going to start with that. And wait, that's not what I wanted. Oh, it's a map. Actually, that didn't do what I thought it would. Oh, I don't want to return the function. Ah, okay. Yeah.
Luigi says make it a lambda, then extract it.
That's exactly what he was.
That you were doing. All
that's
right.
exactly what I was doing. Let me rename this to
die.
And this. And again, that's a horrible name, but we'll go with it for now.
This is bringing me back to wanting this to be in our value object. Doing all this parsing and validation.
So if I value greater than 6, throw internal exception.
Yeah.
And we need a message. So
we check for the NFE here. NFE not found exception. I don't.
Yes, we could. That would be a refactoring. Okay, so now it fails with just the row message.
Yep. And we're going to need to pass the dice hand of dice in.
Yeah. Too. That's going to be...
That's easy. We just add it to the parameter list.
Which one are we at? We're at this one. Darn it. All right.
Okay. Now we can re-enable that remaining test and...
So now it'll fail.
Do the other side of this.
Yep.
Oh, number format exception.
Yeah.
That's what he was saying. Got it.
Yeah, it's not doing what I want. Okay. I understood what you meant, Sweetie, so. Okay. All right.
Okay. Llewellyn Falco has a great little lightning talk that he gives about how he likes to format these things. And it goes like this.
Yeah, the numeric number line.
Yeah.
I don't like it. I understand it. I understand why he does it. I agree with it. And I just don't like it.
I find this to be much more natural as well.
Because I remember when I first heard Llewellyn talk about that, I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. I should try that. And it just, I've been too trained to read it differently. And I just didn't find it, I find it helpful.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing is when you see something strange, like say the word exception missing on a name, it makes your brain stop.
Yep.
And that's actually not a good thing. If you're used to seeing certain idioms, then you want to stick with those idioms.
Yep.
So I will tend to follow the idioms of the language and ecosystem I'm using, even when I don't agree with them, unless I've got a good reason not to follow them.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. I think people are more used to seeing sort of the standard approach that you've got there.
Yeah. What I might do, and that's what I was looking for, the automated way to do this, is I would do this.
Yeah, because we do want them to be more.
We want them in an order, but having the numbers on the outside is just, like you said, it doesn't pattern match for us, and so it's like what, and then it's more prone to error because we're not used to seeing it.
The other thing that we need to do here is, it occurred to me that at least with the test data we have, if you had said less than or equal to 1, this test would not fail. And so I want to put my fence posts right around the off by 1 error.
Yeah, so this is where what I call the 3 sides of the boundary. Where it's so here the boundaries, one of the boundaries is 1, so I do 0, 1, and 2.
Yeah.
And the other boundary is 6, I would do 5, 6, and 7.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, and Sweetie says keep a 6. We do have a 6 up here, so
yeah,
I think that's good enough.
And so I'd probably stick a 5 in there just to be,
Okay. And with that, I think we've finished our hair handling.
Except the test would fail. There we go. Did I catch it?
Did I do something wrong?
You changed the 2 up here, but not in the output, which it exactly happened. And I fixed it right after you hit run. So, yeah.
So, I don't think we've got enough time to do the next thing. But when I look at this and I see all that repeated logic on the right, this pushes me into saying that this should be a responsibility of hand of dice, not the parsing, because we've had that conversation, but the error handling.
Yep.
And then once that's a real genuine production responsibility, then I'm with you. Then I want it to be test driven.
Yep.
If it was just a little runtime assertion to make sure that I wasn't making a dumb mistake, I wouldn't test drive that. But a proper, like now if we're going to say here that, the responsibility of Hand of Dice is to do all the boundary checking.
Right.
Then then that needs to be test driven.
Right.
And also we need to have one test over here on the left that says that we handle whatever exception Hand of Dice throws. Because Hand of Dice, I would have thrown runtime exception.
Exactly.
Because it's not coming from the outside world at that point. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Let's check this in and then we can do our debrief and call it a day.
So is that what we did in this last?
Did we do Hand of Dice or did we do more than that?
That's what I was just checking. So whoops. So we did no, we did all the error checking.
Yeah, just all the corruption, which probably we should have for all database cases. And then if you wouldn't mind, let's put in next. Factor out Hand of Dice checking, or factor Hand of Dice checking to Hand of Dice precondition. Of Hand of Dice.
Yeah.
Dice checks. Yeah. And then after that, nullables. Make it nullable. Make database nullable. And also, we should probably compare and contrast against. Maybe we should do that now. Let's do it. Let's add the next to the next that we need to remove old database wrapper. I think update happens automatically, doesn't it, Suiji?
I don't know. Do we have a test for it?
We don't have a test for it.
Yeah. So we'd have to check that.
Yeah. Make sure updates work.
I think it should work, but.
Yeah, I think it will work, but I think we want to find out.
Yeah, I think if we're not sure, we should probably check it.
It'd be good to have a test for it just for documentation purposes.
Yeah. All right. Anything else you want to capture?
Let's see. Let's put the remove old database adapter before make database nullable. And compare and contrast as well. Compare and contrast approaches. With old database adapter or something like that. Yeah. All right. Final thoughts, Ted?
Yeah, I mean, at this level, this was pretty straightforward in terms of basically adding on all the tests of, if we're worried about if the database is write shared, if somebody else is writing to it, then yeah, doing all of this. And again, thinking about what is the interface? What is the API for these things when errors happen? And I thought that was a really for better or for worse, interesting place we landed with a checked exception at the API level, at the public API level. I thought that was a nice resolution of the problems with streams and checked exceptions.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the way that looking at the errors sort of forced us into thinking about our API more in depth.
Thanks, Pixie.
Thanks for joining us, Pixie. I feel like the dice checks that we did with the numbers and the integers, that this does feel like the wrong place for that. It felt kind of nitty gritty, but the work we did around the duplicate scoreboard rows, that felt very much on target.
Yeah.
The work we did around the game row being empty, that was sort of, as always, the first time we were doing any error handling, so we had to work it out.
Right.
And I don't know if we've talked about this, but I'm sure you think about it this way. Whenever I'm introducing something new in my code, I typically want to start out with a really simple example of that new thing. So, an empty or the duplicate scoreboard was sort of a simple example of how this could go wrong. And then we sort of figured out how we're going to do the errors. And then we go into the game dice and slightly more tricky error scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always about, this when it, like you said, it's like when it's something, when it's sort of the first of something in a new area, it's like, let me just find something that it's going to be enough trouble just figuring out all of the machinery around it. Let me work on something that's as simple as possible. And that's why, like, I'll, for exceptions and stuff, I'm not even worrying about messages. And it's like, just does it throw any exception in the right place? Just get that to work. And then you can start fine tuning things afterwards.
This whole experience that we've had over the last couple of sessions, I think this is our third database stream.
Yeah.
The whole experience, and it's basically done at this point. I think we just have a little refactoring to do. But the whole experience has been extremely familiar. Like, we started out having to figure out, how does the stinking thing work?
Right.
And we beat our head against a wall until we made the magic work. So familiar. That always happens. Then we got the basic thing to go, and that was pretty easy. And then we went into air conditions, and that forced us to really think deeply. Well, what is this really doing? How do we really care about this? We solved a tricky situation, and then we accelerated. And we like bam, 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 case. And then we're looking at, we're like, okay, now we can improve the refactoring, the design,
right,
and we'll be done.
Right.
And that's just such a classic, familiar flow.
Yeah.
Like that's the way it always works out with my narrow integration tests and my adapters. And you take out, you're beating your head against the infrastructure part at the beginning. That's pretty much how every class I write ends up going. It sort of follows this: do the simple case, figure it out, start going fast, then start getting into the error cases and slow down. And it's just fun to see it once again come out that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and sort of noticing the refactoring points and saying, oh, we got some, both on the test side and on the production code side, and seeing, oh, there might be some other things, I think is where it's so easy to say, no, it's done, ship it.
Yeah. And
then you come back and it's like, oh my God, there's so much noise here. Like, I can't even, think about this anymore. And it makes me so sad when people don't do that last bit of you have built up these abstractions in your head. Like you know what this chunk of code represents. And so like I always say, put that back into the code. Like make that, these 8 lines of code mean one thing, create that abstraction in the code. Whiskey's here. You're never too late to pitch Kotlin.
Whiskey, we
mentioned you before. I'm surprised your ears weren't burning.
Yeah. You missed it. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you once again, Ted.
Thanks, Jim. And I'll see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. See y'all later.